Greetings and salutations, my fellow Lars players. Today I will be discussing how to apply silent entry and dynamic entry from neutral and Oki positions. Many Lars players know how to establish silent entry mix-ups after combo enders and knockdowns. For example, 424, back 3-4, and silent entry 3 are all common ways to enforce dynamic entry 2. Once you establish the dynamic entry 2, you can then start applying silent entry. This is an efficient strategy because unless they tech roll or get up immediately, there's no way for them to interrupt or stop your dynamic entry 2. No wake up kick, no low kick, no spring kick. They have to get up or side roll. And if they side roll, you can go into silent entry and all options are uninterruptible. That is the strength in dynamic entry 2. Once your opponent starts side rolling or immediately getting up, you can then also go ahead and start applying a delayed dynamic entry 4-3. A little bit more risky, but it's a little bit harder for them to interrupt if they immediately get up instead of doing a tech roll. As you can see, these moves serve a lot of useful purposes in Oki situations, and a lot of players that use Lars know that. One thing a lot of Lars players, especially newer ones, struggle with is how to apply silent entry moves in neutral. Even dynamic entry, which is a little bit easier to use in neutral, some people have trouble figuring out which moves are optimal, most effective, how to use them, when to use them, and today I will be giving a brief little overview on how to use those moves. So let's begin with dynamic entry. Simply, you can go into dynamic entry and do just a single one, and the interaction is very quick. So quick that usually you can just go into jabs or side steps or perhaps a low, because since there's a second hit that has a slight delay before the first and it doesn't jail, most people are either waiting for that second hit to come out or they're ducking, trying to crouch and punish you. So you have a little bit of mental frame advantage just by doing dynamic entry 1. And it's like +7 on hit and only -1 or so on block. So it's very versatile. Also, if you finish the string dynamic entry 1-2, it has some weird tracking properties, and if they're specifically near the wall, dynamic entry 1-2 will track them for a wall splat. So if you catch them stepping from a distance trying to avoid your while running 3, Lars's main pressure tool, don't be afraid to just dash in and do a dynamic entry 1-2 on occasion. The next move that should not be ignored from dynamic entry is dynamic entry 1+2. It is a high that is -10 on block, but it is safe due to the fact that the move leaves you crouching, so there's no way to punish it. One way to apply this move is just kind of throwing it out randomly from maybe range 2, 3, and just do it. Or sometimes just do a dynamic entry and cancel it. Dynamic entry, cancel it. And eventually, sometimes you may see them throw something out from out of range because they think they may hit you or they think you may go into silent entry. So just keep kind of throwing it out and then just tap it once you see a move come out, because the move comes out very fast after you've already inputted the stance. This is another powerful move that from dynamic entry that often gets neglected, but it's strong. Easily steppable to one side, but it's strong. The last two moves I mentioned are both high, dynamic entry 1 and dynamic entry 1+2. As well as the scary dynamic entry 4-3, which is a low. The enemy has a lot of incentive to try and duck your dynamic entry mix-up. That's where dynamic entry 2 comes in. A powerful, well, it's not that powerful. It's powerful in the idea that it gives you a lot of positive frame advantage, and on counter hit it leads to quite a big combo. It's not the quickest move in the world, but it's faster than dynamic entry 3. And since dynamic entry in season 2 has evasive high properties now, it's not necessarily the worst idea just to throw it out in somewhat of a similar range that you would throw out dynamic entry 1+2, especially if you feel like they're just kind of like randomly crouching your dynamic entry approach. Another way to circumvent them just ducking under your dynamic entry's approach is obviously just stepping during the dynamic entry animation and then canceling it into some type of a mid. Maybe a sidestep 2. That's my personal preference. As you can see, dynamic entry has purposes in Oki as well as neutral situations. Now when we're talking about silent entry, it's a little bit more difficult to use in the neutral because you have to go into one stance, into another stance just to access the move, or you have to use one of your more unsafe moves that can potentially get you launched to access this move, or the moves outside of silent entry, I should say. But there is one attack in Lars's arsenal that allows him to play around with his silent entry and dynamic entry mix-ups at the same time, allowing you to really start to get the most out of Lars's stances. And that move is while standing 2. While standing 2 is 13 frames, and it has a follow-up attack that knocks down on counter hit. That follow-up knockdown enforces the mix-ups Lars gets from his transitions. This is how I would advise using this move. Option 1. Do while standing 2, do nothing, watch your opponent, and then gather information. Option 2. Finish the string if your opponent likes to fidget around after the first while standing 2, and then collect your mix-up between the stomp, the while standing, the forward 1+2, or the forward 2. Once you cause hesitation, you can start doing while standing 2 into forward, and then go into your silent entry mix-up. You can do the low, the wall bounce, down forward 1 for some frames, or you can just get crazy and then do silent entry 3 for a launch if you really put the fear in them with the lows beforehand. And for option 4, probably your most interesting option, you can press down and then go into dynamic entry. And from this stance, they can still chase you down and get an attack, but most people don't instinctively just start running at you after you press while standing 2. The transition is so fast, unless you do it every single time, there's no way of your opponent to really react to it. This conversion is useful on open ground now, because now you can go into silent entry after dynamic entry, which allows you to enforce some type of mix-up if they whiff outside of your range. But if they do some type of attack that comes into range, you can do just 1+2 on whiff and get a launch. This move is even more powerful at the wall, because since the opponent doesn't really have as much distance to dance around, if they press one button, you're probably close enough to do a 1-2 and get a wall bounce after your dynamic. One last transition I'd like to discuss is back 3 into silent entry. Now, this transition is useful at higher level because most people know you have to crouch under the second hit of back 3-4 because it's safe on block. But you can use this information against them, because if they know they need to crouch at the second hit, you can go into silent entry mix-up and then either do another low, or do a launcher, or do a mid, or do pretty much anything. And if they're trying to crouch and then launch, they most likely will get hit by anything. Thank you for sticking around and watching my dynamic and silent entry tips and tricks video. Hopefully you guys learned something and go out there and crush people with the Swedish Mishima. Here's a few clips of me applying my silent entry and dynamic entry tricks on an opponent.
Perfect. You win.